Good morning. Welcome to NEEP's August Ready, Set, Scale webinar. I'm Ara Shore, NEEP's Executive Director, and this is the latest in NEEP's year-long webinar series highlighting policies, solutions, and programs that are ready to replicate and grow. Today, we'll be talking about metrics for equity and how changing the process, goals, and rewards built into program design and delivery can create more equitable outcomes. We've gotten very used to hearing that our region has nation-leading energy efficiency programs, but we know that the benefits of these investments have not been and are not being distributed equally. Last week, NEEP released a report centering equity with data that examines how policymakers and program implementers can use data to center equity through the EM&V process. And today we'll hear from two practitioners who are working on just this. With that, I'll welcome Erin Cosgrove, NEEP's Public Policy Manager and lead author of the NEEP report, to get us going. Good morning, Erin.
Morning, Ara. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction.
You bet. Take it away.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. My name is Erin Cosgrove, and I'm the Public Policy Manager here at NEEP. And so today we'll talk about metrics for equity and energy efficiency programs. And how these metrics can be used to design, deliver, and evaluate programs that provide equal access to the benefits of these programs. Next slide. So just really quickly before we get started, a few things to note. The webinar is being recorded. Also, in our ongoing effort to improve accessibility to both our work and events, we've enabled closed captioning. The control to disable this feature is actually located in the lower right corner of your Zoom video if you'd like to turn it on or off. Also, after this presentation, we will be sure to send out the slides and the recording to everyone who's registered. And just a few more things for the presentation, you will remain on mute, but please remember to use the Q&A and both the chat function to have any questions or state any fun facts, comments, discussions, or any collaborations you'd like to take note as we go through the presentation. And so with next slide, thank you. And so before we get started, I'd like to give a big thanks to our funders and our series sponsor, most of all is Connecticut Deep, with who Vicki Hackett today will be joining us from. So if you want to say hello, Vicki. Hi, Vicki, and introduce yourself very quickly.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Vicki Hackett, and my pronouns are she, her.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And then also the rest of our funders are listed here, who also help NEEP in our collaboration and organization, as well as our network of allies and state partnerships. You know, these resources really help to guide our work and develop our work throughout the region. And with that, I will now kick off our official webinar. So today we will be having, we will have me first go through the overview of our equity webinar report and highlight our newest resource, Centering Equity with Metrics. It's both a webpage and a report, which I'll be talking a little bit more about. And then we'll actually get to hear from two states that are referenced in the report and whose actions we've highlighted. First will be Vicki Hackett, who you just met, and who Bureau Chief and Acting Deputy Commissioner of Energy at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection from Connecticut, and she'll discuss how the state's equitable energy efficiency proceeding has used a robust public engagement process to determine barriers that exist in programs. We will then also hear from Lauren Wentz, Program Manager from VEIC or Efficiency Vermont, and she will discuss Vermont's energy burden analysis, which helped to transform the state's low-income program portfolio by identifying high-burden communities and programs that can serve them. So next slide, please. I will kick us off by introducing our newest resource and the basis for our conversation today. So our new report is called Centering Equity with Metrics, and it's how to incorporate equity and justice in evaluation, measurement, and verification. And so what exactly does centering equity mean? So at NEEP, we've determined that for us, centering equity means that energy efficiency programs need to acknowledge and account for starting line disparities by recognizing the harms of the past, incorporating voices from those who have most been burdened by these decisions, and taking proactive approaches to ensure that the benefits of energy efficiency programs are accessible to every resident. And this requires expanding the objectives of programs to include energy equity, which will require changes in how programs are designed, executed, and evaluated. So our report looks specifically at the EM&V process because this can be a great starting point to drive change, as it relies on the collection and analysis of metrics or data to measure program success. And data is important because it illustrates policy decisions with both numbers and helps hold programs and institutions accountable. And one note, as you'll see in the chat, we're populating it with links and resources for you to look at. If you do open the webpage the report is linked on, you'll see it's both available as a full report and also as takeaway sections that are between 3 to 4 pages. The sections of the report are actually broken up in the order that they're likely to appear as energy efficiency programs are discussed and designed in the state. And this is done to provide ease of access to the information and ensure that as these separate parts of the EM&V process are discussed, policymakers, stakeholders, and implementers are all able to quickly reference the different suggestions, example programs, and recommendations. And next slide, please. Now I'll go into just a little detail about what is in the report. So as stated, this report looks at evaluation, measurement, and verification processes as a starting point to drive change. And the issue with current or traditional EM&V frameworks that evaluate energy efficiency is really that they are designed to evaluate programs on their ability to lower energy costs and maximize savings. This method, though, fails to account for other policy efforts and priorities of energy efficiency programs, including energy equity and decarbonization. And both in policy and in the industry itself, we are seeing a change in the expectations of energy efficiency programs because they can be a powerful tool to enact equitable decarbonization in our building sector, as decarbonization of the building sector provides opportunities to address systemic racial inequities in housing and environmental justice. But to do this, programs have to be proactive and identify ways to engage communities, increase participation, and deliver equitable benefits across the region, which requires a change in how we evaluate and measure the success of programs. Next slide, please. And so we have come up with a new EM&V process, one centered on equity that will be able to provide a baseline understanding of how inequities are embedded in current programs, provide accountability during program design, and ensure measurable real achievement. So the report proposes 6 different steps that states can take to inform different components of the EM&V process, and including establishing goals and performance incentives for programs. And today we're really going to go into the first 2, creating a process for meaningful stakeholder engagement and identifying disparities with an equity gap analysis. But I encourage everyone to please check out the website and the report, as the next 4 sections really do provide some great guidance for the EM&V process, as step 3 is adjusting equity and cost benefit analysis. And this discusses how these tests can serve as a barrier to implementing programs and provides actually 3 ways that states can address this issue now. And then also the next 3 steps that we won't get to today provide different ways of tracking, establishing goals, and establishing performance incentives that center equity, and examples of these metrics in use. And the recommended metrics are actually broken out into the 4 dimensions or 4 pillars of equity that have been established by the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and also adopted for energy efficiency by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. So these metrics are actually separated out into structural metrics, procedural equity metrics, distributional equity metrics, and then transgenerational equity. And this is to really make sure that as programs center equity, you're thinking about the different dimensions and the different ways that inequities appear and can impact program design. So next slide, please. And so before I introduce our guests, I wanted to do a quick overview of the 2 recommendations we'll be diving into today. The first is creating a process for meaningful stakeholder engagement. And I'll also encourage others to please open up the link and read the brief while I go through this. But this step is really how to create a stakeholder engagement process that can serve as a way to collaborate with communities on metrics and identify ways to improve access to energy efficiency programs. And these processes should provide avenues for community members to have authentic leadership roles that define, drive, and hold accountable clean energy policy and program decisions and outcomes. And actually, for the creating a process for meaningful stakeholder engagement, we have 5 steps in the report that we've outlined that we think are great for implementers to follow. And the first is establishing an equity advisory group or proceeding to provide input. And for this step, it's important to identify what the group will inform and it's also important that when policymakers are creating the group, that they are clear that the stakeholder group will not only have a voice on energy efficiency programs, but be able to directly impact design and implementation decisions. The second step we identified is that identifying equity advisory group members and the role of the public. And this step is just to make sure to ensure that the group consists of members that represent marginalized and frontline communities, and also ensure that there's a proportional number of advocates, utilities, businesses, and government staff that are present in the group in order to ensure that proportional representation of the community being served. And then our final couple steps are defining the role and task of the advisory group, incorporating feedback into energy efficiency plans, and also making sure that the stakeholder meeting has regular meetings and that the equity advisory group is maintained throughout the process in order to make sure that the group not only informs what is in front of them at that time, but is able to provide continuous feedback. And then the second step that we will be discussing today is identifying disparities with an equity gap analysis. Now, an equity gap analysis can help regulators and program implementers understand the inequities in the access to benefits of energy efficiency programs and are a really great and important step in understanding how programs can best serve their communities through examining historical successes and shortfalls and identifying areas in the greatest needs of attention. And for the report, we've identified many ways that groups can historically be underserved and also provided 3 recommendations that for states or other program implementers to consider when they think about establishing an equity gap analysis. And so I encourage the audience to please take a look at those. But with that, I'm very excited to actually dive into seeing what these steps look like in action. And so now I will bring up Vicki Hackett. Thank you so much. And Vicki is going to discuss how the state's equitable energy efficiency proceeding has used a robust public input process in order to help create more equitable energy efficiency programs. Very quickly, I'll just say, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And Vicki, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Erin, and good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Vicki Hackett. I'm the Bureau Chief and the Acting Deputy Commissioner for Energy at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And my pronouns, again, are she, her. I'm so happy to be with you talking about the critical topic of energy equity work and the metrics for evaluating our progress in that work. We have a variety of work going on in energy equity at the moment. And the one thing that I'll just say sort of off the bat is that it all requires maintaining flexible approaches to program design and implementation that can be adjusted based on how our metrics reflect that we're doing and based on improved stakeholder engagement practices, which, we just sort of continue to get better at. I'm going to talk to you about 3 different initiatives today. The first and the area of focus is our equitable energy efficiency or E3 proceeding. And next, I'll just talk quickly about a program we're implementing as a result of that proceeding to address health and safety barriers to energy efficiency and affordable housing. And finally, the formation by Governor Lamont by an executive order of the Connecticut Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Next slide, please. So a couple of years ago, when I came on as deputy of the Bureau of Energy and Technology Policy at DEEP, we quickly determined that we needed to look harder at equity and energy justice within the ratepayer-funded conservation and load management plan that we oversee and that the utilities administer. this was also a determination of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. And so we did this through a process that we called our Equitable Energy Efficiency Proceeding. This slide shows you the vision statement that we developed through an intensive stakeholder engagement process that I'll discuss more in a few minutes. It was really important that the stakeholders and members of the public had a voice in developing this vision statement and continue to have a voice in its evolution over time. Next slide, please. So here's a bit more detail, and I'll discuss from the vision statement, and I'll discuss each bullet in turn. So number one, reducing energy burdens for all customers. So in Connecticut, we have generally the highest electric rates in the continental US. This creates a very high energy burden for people with low income in Connecticut. So the second bullet is recognizing and working to remediate past harm by prioritizing historically overburdened and underserved communities. This recognizes that we need to account for and address the harm that was caused to those who live in communities with higher air pollution, or caused by the siting of fossil fuel resources, for example, or who have been paying into the programs, ratepayer funded programs for long periods of time without being able to participate or benefit to the extent of other ratepayers, as just two examples of past harm that need to be remediated. Next is mitigating and working to eliminate barriers to participation in energy efficiency programs. So folks with lower income, as we know, often tend to live in multi-dwelling units that are historically less likely to participate in our programs if landlords don't consent to or spearhead that participation, or have health and safety barriers to efficiency in their housing, such as mold or asbestos. Then we have including accessible and transparent processes for incorporating residents' priorities and lived experiences into program design and decision-making. We know that many of our processes for decision-making, from inception to finalization, have not historically been accessible or inclusive to overburdened and underrepresented communities in the field of energy. So that's something we're actively working on. Increasing access to the benefits of clean energy and the clean energy economy. And this just reflects one of the primary goals of this proceeding and the Governor's Council on Climate Change and the work that they did. Next slide, please. So we started this process with an extensive stakeholder process, again, within the Governor's Council for Climate Change, and we carried it through, and it was also sort of bubbling up through our regular stakeholder engagement with our energy efficiency vendor community, through the public processes that we hold for our annual review of the CNLM plan, and through the Energy Efficiency Board processes. They, in Connecticut, the Energy Efficiency Board has the role of first reviewing proposed energy efficiency plans before they come to DEEP. So what we did here, as you can see on the slide, in May of 2021, we released the draft phase 1 determination, and that was, again, informed by those earlier stakeholder processes. We held a public comment period on that draft determination, and we announced the details in a public technical meeting. And then we held, again, a public technical meeting, also a public input session in the evening, so that people who couldn't make the technical meeting during working out, daytime working hours, we had an alternative meeting in the evening. And for the evening session, we tried to include a more open dialogue and more accessible information for people who might not work in the field or have access to, our language of acronyms, for example. And then in mid-June of 2021, we had our deadline for public written comment. In July of 2021, we released the final phase 1 determination. And in that determination, I just want to walk through a few of the goal, or at least the goals that we issued in that determination. So goal 1 was to embed greater equity in decision making, and the action item that we identified for that was directing the EEB, the Energy Efficiency Board, to develop a plan to hire a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, and to solicit nominations for board membership in a more inclusive manner to increase board diversity. Goal number 2 was enhancing tracking of equity indicators in CNLM programs. Goal number 3 was developing metrics and goals to assess equitable distribution of energy efficiency funding. Goal number 4 was improving program participation and impacts among moderate income customers. Goal number 5 was streamlining the eligibility process for low income programs. Goal number 6 was improving outreach to high need or high impact populations. Goal number 7 was to address health and safety barriers to low income weatherization access, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Goal number 8 was addressing and removing barriers to participation among renters, which I know we're all familiar with that sort of long-term problem. Next slide, please. So now we're at the point where we're tracking the progress of phase 1 while working on implementing phase 1 and also scoping out phase 2 of the E3 proceeding. So we release these easy to digest tracking reports publicly for accountability purposes, and we're currently preparing to release our summer report. Next slide, please. So here you can see an example page of one of our tracking reports showing 2 action items that actually were already completed, but you can see that we use sort of the red stoplight to green go. And what we do is we show where each action item is on each report that we release. Next slide, please. There may have been one before this, or we may be missing the graphic. But, oh, there it is. Okay, so this dashboard shows our progress to date. And so far for phase 1, we have completed 8 phase 1 has 8 goals and 19 action items to enhance equity in our energy efficiency programs. And some of the action items that we've completed include hiring the DEI consultant for the EEB. And I think we're in the final contract negotiation process now of bringing that consultant on board, implementing a process to increase diversity on the EEB through a more inclusive application process for board membership, and we're doing really well with that. I'm really excited about that. We also proposed, and it was passed, legislation to increase the board membership to include a member to represent customers with low income and a member to represent municipalities. We've also improved equity metrics for program evaluation, and we've developed an internal process to make public participation opportunities more accessible. Next slide, please. I'm also really happy to say that we've made very significant progress on goal 7 of the E3 determination, addressing health and safety barriers to weatherization. So the goal of the program is to address health and safety issues that prevent the completion of residential weatherization and energy efficiency measures. And this provides a path to lower household energy costs and energy burden, but can also generate non-energy benefits that improve physical and social determinants of health, population health, and social equity. So to develop this program, we started with a stakeholder process through our Low Income Energy Advisory Board in the early stages of program design. The governor then proposed the program to the legislature as a use of ARPA funding, which have to be legislatively approved in Connecticut. The legislature was very supportive, giving us $7 million for this program and an additional $7 million for energy improvements to affordable housing. And from that, our Office of Affordable Housing Energy Retrofits was born. We then engaged in a public input process in developing our RFP for the program. We drafted the RFP with stakeholder input and released it for public comment, which helped instruct the final RFP. And then DEEP selected ICAS as a program operator. ICAS is a nonprofit with a 20-year history of designing and managing utility-wide, statewide, and federal programs to deliver green solutions to low-income households. Next slide, please. So here you'll see our timeline for where we are now and next steps in the program. Next slide, please. And finally, I just want to take a moment to also discuss an exciting development in Connecticut. The Connecticut Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Council, or CEJAC, was formed recently, constituted out of Governor Lamont's climate-centered Executive Order 21-3. And you can see the mission on this slide. CEJAC membership includes 3 representatives of environmental justice communities, which for purposes of this executive order shall be defined as members of communities of color, members or representatives of low income communities, representatives of community-based organizations, or academics with knowledge about or experience in environmental justice, climate change, racial inequity, or any other area determined by the commissioner to be of value to the CJAC. Membership also includes 3 representatives of Connecticut-based environmental advocacy organizations, 2 representatives of large and small business and industry, 2 representatives from municipalities or regional councils of government, and also includes state agency members, including the Department of Public Health, Department of Economic and Community Development, the Department of Housing, and the Department of Transportation. And additional members can be appointed as needed in furtherance of the purpose of the CJAC. This is just a really exciting development for us in Connecticut because it's a way to give stakeholders who have been historically underrepresented more of a consistent voice, and it provides us with a process that we can turn to get that input in a more structured way. So really excited to announce the formation of the CJAC in Connecticut, and happy to report back with how that progresses over time. And that's it from Connecticut today.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Please, attendees, remember to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll be sure to get to them after the presentation is done. And with that, we could say goodbye to Vicki and now welcome Lauren Wentz from Efficiency Vermont to talk about equity gap analysis and specifically the energy burden study that Vermont has conducted recently. So welcome, Lauren.
Great, thanks so much, Erin. If you can give a thumbs up if you could hear me. Oh, sorry.
I can, sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. Well, great to be with you all this morning. My name is Lauren Wentz, and I'm a program manager at Efficiency Vermont. And the focus of my work is in overseeing our programs that serve our low-income customers and also our multifamily housing market, including building owners and operators, as well as the renters who reside in those properties. I'm excited to talk to you all today about the energy burden report that Efficiency Vermont published last in 2019, and also speak to some of the kind of program changes and outcomes that have been born out of that effort and that report itself. So in 2019, we updated the very first Vermont Total Energy Burden report that we first published a few years prior to that. And what that report essentially looks at is spatial patterns in heating, electric, and transportation costs. And in 2019, the updated report really focused on kind of adapting 2 main things. One, we aggregated data by town rather than census block, so that we could help localities and communities to improve the applicability of the results of the report in local planning efforts. We also use Vermont-specific thermal energy usage data rather than New England more broadly to help provide some greater specificity to folks living in Vermont. So in terms of kind of how we can understand the results overall of the report that we published, and what we wanted to really look at was how much of Vermont residents were experiencing energy burden and the degree to which that influences and can help to change programs that serve vulnerable, historically excluded, or historically underserved customers and communities. And what the report further kind of provided us insight on and kind of doubled down on is that we can use energy burden through program design and implementation in a way that helps to serve residential customers to help lower their energy costs through investments across the board. And that includes in businesses that also create jobs, raise wages in rural communities and throughout the state of Vermont. So I want to first focus a little bit on the programs that we've transformed in our low-income portfolio of services and programs. And this update really started and initiated in 2019, but was informed by and definitely influenced by the results of the first energy burden report. And what that change boiled down to was an initial problem statement. So essentially although the longstanding low-income program that Efficiency Vermont offered to qualifying customers throughout the state, and the requirement there was below 80% AMI, and whether or not you used at least 10,000 kWh per year in electricity. That program was highly successful. It routinely hit required metrics and also internal goals around quantity of customers served, strengthening relationships with the local weatherization agencies who are the service deliverers of that program. We also, through that program, largely hit our required key performance indicator of spend on low-income customers throughout the state as required by our regulators. All of that pointed to a great success. But what we began to realize too is that we were in fact excluding many customers from being able to take advantage of energy efficiency programs that impact energy bills and affordability and housing security because of the focus on energy usage alone. And so the theory of change that we began to look at in terms of overhauling our low-income programs to really center on equity in design and in practice is this. By focusing and centering energy burden in program qualification, what we can do is better address customer needs as defined by energy use, ability to pay and afford those bills, and energy consumption. And in the process, what we can do is distribute the program dollars we have available more equitably too. If we're allocating the vast majority of budget allocation for low-income customers on one single program that serves approximately 300 customers annually, are we really reaching low-income customers across the state at the pace and also in the breadth and scope that we really desire and we know is needed for an equitable energy transformation and transition? And so what we did was we took a step back and we full sail shifted our eligibility criteria process to center on energy burden. So now customers qualify for programs, or low-income programs, based on energy usage, yes, but also percentage of energy burden. And depending on what those two factors are, customers will now qualify for one of 4 different programs, and they range in scale from breadth and depth based on a customer's need as expressed by energy usage annually and also energy burden. And so we're able to cater to approximately 3 times the number of low-income customers every year than we were previously, in large part by focusing on energy burden as that eligibility criteria. One of the other main aspects of the energy burden report that I wanted to focus on today in terms of what we've been up to as a result of the learnings and the findings in that and the data and the gap analysis is our work in what we call focus communities. If you all take a look at the energy burden report published in 2019, it makes reference to targeted communities. We've actually more recently shifted that name, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but I'll refer to it here as focus communities. So there are a few different offers or programs that I wanted to highlight to speak to kind of what this effort is. But essentially recognizing that there are pockets of across the state of Vermont who have particularly high energy burden and may be historically less served by Efficiency Vermont services and the benefits accrued by those services. How can we really direct more resources, more intensive staff time, and double down on our program efforts in specific communities each year? And so Efficiency Vermont has every year essentially focused on 2 to 4 communities to really kind of provide this level of support across the spectrum, from the residential sector to the business and industrial sector and what have you. So one example of an offer that we provided is what we call the nonprofit program bonus. And so nonprofit organizations can take advantage of any existing Efficiency Vermont service and incentive for a project. But in addition to that, the nonprofit bonus in these focused communities, for example, covers up to 90% of a project cost, up to $5,000 per project. And we allocate about 3 nonprofit bonuses per community on average per year. And eligible nonprofits need to be those that serve the community and provide a health, safety, welfare service to vulnerable populations. And some examples of, or great example of a type of nonprofit that's taken advantage of this are local food shelves local food shelves. And so in the process, what they can do is overhaul lighting or refrigeration equipment, therefore helping to drive down their covering costs and do more of the work that they do to serve more people in the community. So how can we help to support vulnerable residents throughout the state of Vermont by helping to support the business operations and help to make the costs more affordable for those very nonprofit organizations who are helping to serve and provide better wraparound services and care to those customers? So the other program that I wanted to speak to is what we call our Municipal Bonus. So similar, but different. So what this is actually up to 100% of the project cost, capped at $4,000. So the types of projects that are available are, again, anything that qualifies currently for an Efficiency Vermont bonus, or sorry, Efficiency Vermont services. And the types of things that fall under this category historically have been completely, let's say, overhauling custom lighting in municipal offices throughout the town offices, recognizing that those utility costs are taxpayer dollars. And if those bills are lower, how else can that municipality reinvest in a community that may have really high energy burden for its customers? So one thing I wanted to speak to that I started to mention before is a shift to naming this program, so to speak, as kind of focused communities instead of targeted communities. One of the things that the energy burden report really zeroed in on, certainly, are the specific towns and regions within the state of Vermont that experience particularly high energy burden. And transportation costs are factored into that report. And Vermont is largely a rural state, and so transportation costs play a heavy role in that. However, the report also indicated that certainly low wages is the primary contributing factor to what happens or what contributes to energy burden overall. But what we began to realize is that by solely looking at energy burden as the sole criteria for selecting these focused communities every year, there may have been something that we were missing in the process. And so it's kind of the next iteration of this work. And so we had been relying on energy burden data for that selection process, but we also recognize that this doesn't always or only reflect that intersectionality of an individual community or household identity and their lived experience around energy vulnerability and insecurity. And so we looked at various different reports as well, such as a report published at the University of Vermont called Energy Justice Gaps and Renewable Energy Transition Policy Initiatives in Vermont. We've looked at ACEEE's work in this space as well and recognized specifically in the state of Vermont, low-income renters are approximately 3 times more likely to experience energy burden in the state of Vermont, and non-white Vermonters are 7 times more likely to go without heat in the state of Vermont. And so this sort of data helps us to inform how might we not just select communities that we're going to kind of focus our attention on, but why. And so for this year, starting in 2022 into 2023 as well, we've selected 2 communities where there's the highest population of renters in the state, or one of the highest population of renters, recognizing that there is a large also disparity in the state of Vermont between homeownership amongst BIPOC Vermonters, and recognizing that the vast majority of renters are also low income. And so how can we begin to layer dimensions of equity and experiences of inequity to help inform where we direct our programs and services and what those services look like? And so one of the things we're doing currently is continuing to improve, but also add new services and programs directed at rental property owners, specifically private rental property owners, although we also work deeply and in a longstanding way with our affordable housing partners, but also services directly directed specifically to renters. And that includes access to free LEDs, water saving devices. It also includes enhanced incentives to rental property owners for appliance replacements, such as laundry equipment, refrigerators, to incentivize at time of turnover or certainly before failure, appliance failure, replacement of those major items. So those are just some of the things I wanted to highlight today that have kind of come out of and since the energy burden report and our understanding of where might there be gaps in our services, how might we be able to address those through really centering equity in design, but also addressing energy burden more holistically overall. So I think that covers, Erin, what I was hoping to discuss today, but of course, when we get into it, welcome any and all questions.
Great, thank you so much, Lauren. And I'll invite Vicki to come back on as well. And again, I'll just reiterate to everyone, if you have any questions or if anything came up that you'd like to hear either one of our presenters talk a little bit more on, please feel free to pop a question into the Q&A the Q&A function, and we will be sure to get to that. But for now, I'm going to start off our question session, and I think Vicki, I'm going to put you on the hot seat first. So I'm guessing that you've gone through a couple different processes of designing energy efficiency plans. This is the first time that Connecticut does have, I believe, an energy efficiency advisory board, but this is the first time they used an equity-focused advisory board. And what are maybe a couple of takeaways or big changes that you saw in the discussions that helped to change the conversation around the plans and inform the plans?
Well, just to clarify, the CJAC was just formed. So we actually haven't gone through a process with the CJAC yet. However, and since I've come on, we do an annual review of our conservation and load management program. The EEB, the Energy Efficiency Board, advises on the development of that program, and then it comes to us for an annual review. So since I've come in, we have definitely taken more of a direction, with our Commissioner Katie Dykes coming into as Commissioner of DEEP. One of her areas of focus was an equity lens on all of our work. So we have been applying that since I've been in as a Deputy Commissioner, and there was lots of work done before then as well. And so each one of our annual determinations contains concrete determinations and orders for the utilities to follow about making the programs more equitable. But we learn more each year, and sometimes you try new things. During COVID, we did a lot of work with our vendor community to keep the vendors afloat, many of whom are small woman or minority-owned businesses. We really engaged very heavily with them during COVID to make sure that they stayed afloat and that they were able to provide their important energy services and reduce the energy burden for folks who needed it the most during COVID. So that was one of our biggest areas, I think, of focus. And then we just reviewed our 3-year plan and finished that review, and we have a variety of equity areas of implementation there as well. One of the things I'm most excited about, though, is getting the DEI consultant for the Energy Efficiency Board, because we've sort of been waiting for that before we launch our next phase of the proceeding. So I think between that and now having the CJAC in place, we're sort of well situated to continue to implement phase 1, but start to think about how to launch phase 2.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think, Lauren, I'll bounce back to you. You did mention that now for Efficiency Vermont has started to kind of expand the scope and not just look at energy burden. So, and I apologize if you covered this, but if you were, is the state considering conducting maybe another energy burden analysis to compare before and after, or would you hopefully maybe try to expand or conduct a new kind of analysis in order to create a more informed kind of overview of programs?
Great question. To my knowledge, there's no current further update underway since the data analysis that informed the 2019 published report. That said, at a programmatic level, we're definitely interested in looking at a number of different things. One of them being, to what degree are we actually having an impact on energy burden for those customers who go through, let's say, our primary low-income programs? Are they actually achieving what they are meant to achieve, which is, of course, the thing that is ultimate and should be held as primary? But there's always what is it intended to do, and to what degree are we achieving that? What we are also looking at is establishing internal as well as external equity metrics to help track a lot of the other efforts we're trying to achieve around accrued benefits, as well as percentage of participation amongst underserved communities, whereas energy burden is but one facet or one way to define an underserved or historically excluded population. It's possible to do it in many other ways. And depending on access to data, of course, that always kind of reigns supreme. I think there's definite, not just interest, but efforts underway internally to really make headway in that way.
Great, thank you. Yes, so now I'll pass it back over to Vicki. Vicki, I was wondering if you actually could expand. So Connecticut had the had the stakeholder process. And then in the draft determinations, one of the takeaways was one of the draft determinations was redefining how DEEP looks at equity and defines equity. And it highlighted how it used to reference parity, and now you want to kind of change that definition in order to embrace Justice 40 initiatives and similar. And I was kind of wondering if you could expand on how you came to that conclusion and what you're kind of hoping, or what you're, I guess, how you think you see this playing out and what you're hoping to learn.
Yeah, so historically, we have focused we have a requirement to file an equitable distribution report every year, and we have focused on sort of a different view of equity, which is more that you're sort of hitting customers in all of the service territories, all areas of the service territories covered by the utilities. That's been how it's been tracked in the past. And certainly, you know, one of the outcomes of the E3 proceeding was that we should be tracking a variety of other metrics. And that's what we're starting to put in place now. But you have to have a starting point, right? So, it was difficult to track those metrics looking in reverse. You could do a little bit of work with that using data that the utilities collect and so forth. But so what we did through the E3 proceeding was establish some of the metrics that we expected them to begin tracking. And then we sort of put a pin in it until the DEI consultant could come on board and help us further refine those metrics for tracking. But, we did start with some of, the sort of easier to identify metrics that we wanted to make sure that we were tracking. And I also see a question. Can I answer the question in the chat?
Yes, please go ahead.
About the LIEAB process. So the Low Income Energy Advisory Board has a variety of members who are very active and have become especially, more active, I would say even recently, in energy policy. And there's a lot of really exciting work going on there. So the stakeholders in that group and stakeholders, involved in the CNLM process for many years have been calling for a health and safety barrier remediation program. It's not a new thing. I mean, any of you who have been practicing in this area for a long time know that that's something that, has been identified for a long time as a barrier to implementation for weatherization in an equitable manner. So there was sort of a concerted effort among many of the stakeholders on the Low Income Energy Advisory Board to ask the Department of Social Services, who oversees that funding, the LIHEAP funding, if we could use some LIHEAP funding to address health and safety barrier mitigation. So that process was underway through the Low Income Energy Advisory Board, and then we sort of leveraged that groundswell of support for the legislative proposal for the ARPA funding. And so that ARPA funding, then we were able to say we will knit that funding together with LIHEAP funding, which was even more compelling story to be able to use the LIHEAP funding, right? And then over time, because the ARPA funding only lasts for so long, right? Over time, as we demonstrate success with the ARPA funding, then we can, through the LIEAB, approach, our sister agency again and think about getting, more funding for health and safety barrier mitigation through LIHEAP. So that's how that process worked. And I definitely want to give credit to the people who worked on this for many, many, many years before I was deputy commissioner or bureau chief of the Bureau of Energy and Technology Policy. But we just sort of leveraged that groundswell of support for the legislative proposal.
Oh yeah, and I did want to ask you while you're on the hot seat, seeing legislation to use the ARPA funds, I would say I think Connecticut was one of the first states I saw do it so purposefully. Mentioned the Low Income Advisory Board was a key partner in that. Is there anything else you think you'd say to other states or other advocates that are considering finding ways or encouraging the use of ARPA or even the new federal funding in order to grow these programs? And Lauren, I'll go to you for additional input after this.
I mean, my advice is to just jump in conceptually, just jump in and say you're going to do it, and then you can figure out how to do it. Because it can seem overwhelming figuring out how to do these things. I'm creating a whole new office, which we've now been working really hard on for the past year since the legislation was passed, creating a new affordable housing energy retrofit office, and we're also creating a new broadband office within our bureau, which also will have ties in with our affordable housing energy retrofit office as we think about affordable access to broadband, which connects so much to our energy future, right? So it's a lot of work setting up these new programs, but you have to do it. I mean, it's the work that really sort of, makes me feel good about the job, that I have and the service that we're providing to Connecticut's ratepayers. So it's very rewarding, but it is a lot of work. And my advice is to just jump in and say you'll do it and then figure it out.
Thank you. Lauren, anything to add?
Sure. What I was hoping to add is similarly, Efficiency Vermont has really worked to leverage ARPA funding that we've received to date to help to serve customers better and kind of more comprehensively who might otherwise kind of fall behind in, let's say, the state's goals around weatherized units or weatherization as a whole and kind of the energy transition. So for example, with a $5 million ARPA allocation that Efficiency Vermont received, one of the main kind of program sources where that's been directed to is within our Home Performance with Energy Star program. So for example, customers can receive up to $5,000 or 75% of their project costs back in an added bonus as funded by ARPA. The average weatherization project, home performance project in the state typically hovers right around $7,500. So it's hopefully going to transform the kind of the market even further. That program, of course, because of ARPA requirements and regulations, and it's also because we see where the need is greatest, is eligible for customers who are moderate income as well as low income, although we certainly encourage and know that first and foremost, low income customers should be availing themselves of free weatherization services through the state's weatherization assistance program. That said, customers of any income level can also take advantage of Efficiency Vermont's home energy loan, which provides up to or as low as 0% interest rate on loans for both low and moderate income customers. So when kind of pairing these services together, how can we really begin to serve customers who are in highest need and who may otherwise kind of fall behind on the state's goals?
Great, thank you. And Lauren, I'm going to stick with you for the next question,
Sure.
and then I'll go to the one in the chat. But Efficiency Vermont uses energy burden data to redesign programs. And I guess this is more of a data question, but how do you identify households in order to help serve the programs? And I guess what kind of outreach also do you do for the Focus Communities program in order to kind of elevate the programs to households that might not have been reached before?
Great question. Different answers for both. So I'll try to be relatively brief, but happy to loop back. So for our kind of, I'll call them it's the low income portfolio, those 4 programs that I spoke to where we center energy burden as the eligibility criteria. So for that program, we rely on both word of mouth as well as direct mail outreach to likely income eligible customers. And the call to action for them is to contact Efficiency Vermont to see if they qualify. We also rely on a lot of community partners, our relationships with regional planning commissions, with town energy committees, to also speak to local residents about the programs that customers can get at low or most of the time no cost for income eligible customers. So those are a number of different tactics that we use. But in terms of the process for application or enrollment, it's designed to be streamlined and straightforward and to limit barriers as much as possible. So that includes about a 20-minute conversation with someone in our customer support department to really go through that process of determining eligibility as well as energy burden on the spot, as well as therefore the program that they would qualify for. So it's more of a, we are outreaching to folks to engage those households that may qualify. On the Focus Communities front, that is working with a lot of local groups, nonprofit groups, CBOs, the towns and town offices themselves to really not just plan for what activities may do, but what are the priorities and needs of the town, and where can we best direct our efforts to really support as holistically as possible, and in the process centering equity not just for the customers we're serving, but how we're conducting that work too.
Great, thank you. And then the question in the chat, I believe, is for Vicky, and it comes from Kathy Fay. And she says, although I've been able to find energy burden data for Connecticut, it was developed by organizations outside of Connecticut and seems to be outdated. She's wondering if there's any kind of plan to establish an official baseline mapping of energy burden or an energy burden metrics for determining how an individual household might qualify, kind of similar to what VEIC is describing, or anything along those lines.
So Kathy, thank you for that question. We relied in our equitable energy efficiency proceeding on energy burden study that was conducted, I believe it was by Operation Fuel in Connecticut. It's a Connecticut nonprofit. So that's what we relied on just for background data on energy burden. For qualification for our programs, we have we really have a lot of ways that people can qualify fairly easily for our programs. So if they are already a utility hardship customer, they're automatically qualified for our income eligible program. We're also working to share data between the Department of Social Services and the utilities to determine to make people utility hardship customers sort of automatically if they're eligible for certain Department of Social Services programs, so that people won't have to go through an onerous application process to access a suite of available programs available through the utilities. And also, I'll just mention while I'm talking about that, there's also a process underway. We were a couple years ago in the Take Back Our Grid Act after Storm Isaias. One of the things that that we advocated to include in that act was for PURA to consider a low income rate for customers with low income. And PURA is nearing the end of that proceeding now. We've been very actively engaged in advocating for a progressive low income rate that hardship customers who are already identified and already qualify for other state programs can also participate in. So we're just looking to, as much as possible, make it sort of a one application approach as much as possible. We're working towards that goal over time. So I don't know if that answers your question, Kathy, but that's also something I know I talk to Kathy a lot in Connecticut, so happy to talk to you more about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer, Vicky. And then I believe to close out the webinar here, our theme is Ready, Set, Scale. And I was kind of wondering, and we'll go whoever would like to answer first, Lauren or Vicky, if you have any resources for advocates or program implementers or other state office workers that are looking to implement either the burden study similar to what happened in Vermont, or creating an advisory group similar to what happened to Connecticut, but any resources that you'd like to point to or highlight that are really great for people to use in this space. Lauren, you're unmuted, so I'm going to put you on the spot first.
I realized that I jumped the gun. I may have volunteered myself. It's a great question. There's kind of never-ending resources. I would say one of my most trusted resource for program design, but level setting kind of approach, goal design, all of that in terms of in the equity space is ACEEE, absolutely. And their routine updating of their energy burden in households report. I would also point to ACEEE's kind of equity project, as well as the energy equity project out of the University of Michigan, and specifically in designing energy efficiency programs that really try to address equity in ways that I think challenge our industry, but are really critically necessary to not just bringing along least served customers in a just energy transition, but as well as kind of leveraging energy efficiency and all of the funding that will be coming more so now than ever, right, to do this work in ways that address those historical harms, but also kind of rewrite a future that does and is more equitable, looks more equitable and is more equitable.
Thank you so much. And Vicky, yeah, any resources or guidance you'd like to give?
For us, the greatest resources were the people working for the organizations that are the feet on the ground, our vendor community who are dealing with our residents in Connecticut and trying to help them overcome the high energy burden that they face. our nonprofit organizations and representatives of nonprofits who are either on our energy efficiency board or appear before us as stakeholders in endless proceedings and technical meetings and public meetings or written comments. The amount of work that people have put in on these issues over a long period of time and that are finally gaining traction. It's really, there's an incredible body of work that's been done by a lot of people who haven't been heard for a long time and maybe are starting to be heard now, which is really exciting that it's happening now. But this work is not new. It's been going on for a very long time. So I think for us, you know, it's our internal staff and managers who are really, we have an incredible team, and then it's our community of stakeholders.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much, Lauren and Vicki, for these excellent presentations and to giving us a little bit of insight into how you've incorporated and made sure that there's equitable access to energy efficiency benefits for everyone in your state. And with that, we've hit 12 o'clock on the dot. So thank you also to our audience and everyone that provided great questions for us. Please mark your calendars. We'll have our next Ready, Set, Scale webinar on September 27th at 11 a.m. And with that, we will end the webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.